Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to another lecture of web and mobile systems. In the last class, we had kind of discussed about the first prototype that we were handling with respect to a JavaScript project, wherein we developed a basic calculator app which supported simple arithmetic operations. Okay, the key takeaways from that particular project that we did was to basically understand how, on a fundamental level, can we add interactivity and dynamic aspects to our JavaScript-based project that we are developing, the web systems that we are developing using JavaScript, and so on and so forth, right? And two of the primary things that we learn when it comes to JavaScript is the fact that there is what we call as a DOM API, essentially, which is used in order to embed these interactions and manipulations on our front-end systems, right? And in order to do that, there is an object that is a part of the DOM API that is known as the document object, right? And essentially anything that you put on your web page, essentially with respect to the body tags of your HTML files, can be accessed using this document API or DOM API, as people would like to call it, right? So the two primary things that we learned there is how, using this DOM API, we can essentially link our JavaScript logic, right, or JavaScript file or whatever we are using in order to kind of apply this interactive aspects and these dynamic aspects to our front end from the HTML file. So we can connect any HTML element that is present either by using the type ID or by using the class name or by using the tag names, right? Or by using CSS type selectors. How can we kind of link up these different elements and store them as objects within our JavaScript file? And then the other thing that we learned, which is very important, is to how to track different events on our web page, right? And essentially, events are categorized as a user interaction that takes place with your web page. So if the user, let's say, clicks a certain area or a certain HTML element on your web page, or if the user presses the keyboard buttons and stuff like that, if they're typing something. So those are known as events on a web page. And there are different events that you can track using JavaScript. So essentially, that also takes place using the properties and the methods that is provided through the document object that is a part of the DOM API itself, right? And beyond that, it's up to you with respect to the logic of what you want to implement and stuff like that. So continuing along those lines, in today's class, we're going to do a code walkthrough to understand another simpler project that is built purely using JavaScript in terms of interaction, and that is known as the quiz app, right? So here we can put in the revision is how to kind of link up HTML elements with JavaScript, and basically how to track events on the interface. Okay, basically that is done by using this method that is known as add event listener. It's also a part of the DOM API objects and properties. So it takes two parameters. The first parameter is basically what type of event that you're trying to track, which is a string input parameter. And then you have what we call as a callback function. So essentially the whole logic of the callback function is, in the case this event that you're tracking does happen, right? What are you going to do about it, right? That is, what logic are you going to execute because of a certain event taking place on your web systems, right? So that is the callback function. It is typically written as an arrow function notation, or you can write it as a traditional function, but that is just going to kind of make your code base a little bit more tedious to follow. Okay, so the quiz app that we are going to be doing a code walkthrough today, okay, not a code ride along, but mostly a code walkthrough, and the code is available. Okay, so what we are going to learn here is, again, basically revise the basics of using JavaScript, right? So we are again going to capture the fundamentals, things that we learned in the previous prototype or the demo that we had gone through, is like, again, how to connect your elements, revise those stuff, and then how to apply event listeners and write the logic around those event listeners and those kind of things, right? But in addition to this, we will also be doing another aspect or implementing another logical aspect within the JavaScript, which is basically timer functions, right? Because the quiz app that we're going to be developing will be limited by a certain amount of time that the users will get in order to answer their questions. And the whole logic is that once the timer expires, the user will not be able to answer the questions anymore. And the ability of the user to interact with the interface will be gone, right? So essentially, if you have any kind of app logic that you're trying to develop, which kind of depends on timing, right? So timing aspect is involved. So then this example kind of generally applies to those logical scenarios where you can use the timer in order to kind of restrict the user actions or behaviors after that timer has expired. And the user can only interact with your interface when the timer is, so to speak, live or active, or it is counting down, right? So we're going to learn about those timer functions and stuff like that. And in addition to all of these things, we will, of course, be kind of revising our basic HTML. We also will be revising our basic CSS, looking at the different components that are available and stuff like that. So we are going to keep a track of that as well. Just keep on revising those different types of things. Okay, so the logic of the app. So from a programming perspective, the logic that we are going to kind of implement with respect to the quiz app is basically, as you can see here, you will have a start button to kind of start the quiz, right? So the first step is basically to start the quiz in terms of a workflow. And if the user clicks on the button, then basically the app is presented to the user, right? Now, you have a question bank of different questions and on their options that you're going to show to the user. So this quiz app is basically a multiple choice kind of question quiz app, basically. So we are going to be storing the questions and their answers locally on the user's terminal. Right? And what we are going to do is that we are going to dynamically populate the questions one by one. Okay, so that means that I don't want to show all of my questions in a single rendering of the web page. So that means, let's say if I have 5 questions, I don't want the page to show all of the 5 questions in a single render of the web page. So like when the user clicks on start quiz, it should not be the case that all of my, let's say 5 questions, I have sufficient real estate here in order to put 5 questions. If you think of a desktop interface, right? And we are in the web system domain. So we have a lot of pixels to work with in order to display just a measly amount of 5 questions, which probably has 4 options each, right? So in total, there will be probably about like 20 sentences that we will need, or 20 new lines that we will need, and that is very much possible. But we don't want to do that, right? We essentially don't want to do a hard coding of the questions and the options that you will have, right? Because the reason why we want to dynamically populate is because if you think of this in terms of a fully fledged full stack environment and not just a front-end environment where you don't want to store the questions and answers locally on the user's terminal, right? As a JavaScript file, you don't want to use their local storage. Then essentially what will happen for a quiz app like this, right? That you will be storing these questions and answers probably in some sort of database that will be connected to the backend. Right? So essentially, whenever the user says next, right, in terms of accessing the next question, that will send a request to your server, and the server will then, based on the logic that has been implemented for that particular script, it will most probably access the next question in a probably a random fashion from your database, and it will kind of send back that question and answer the set of options that is available back to the client side or the front end side. And then it is the duty of your front end to populate that new set of question and their options. So in such a scenario, in such a realistic scenario, you cannot hard code the questions. If you do, then the order of the questions and everything else, the type of questions that you're presenting kind of remains fixed, right? So that is not the best way to go about it when you're working on a practical application like this. So we are not working or focusing on a backend side or a database here. So what we are going to do is we're going to create a JavaScript file, which is going to act as our storage file. So we are using a pseudo way of like file system based storage, and we're going to send that file system to the user, right? So that means when this app loads right now, all of this question bank is basically stored on the local system, right? So it is stored in my terminal, right, essentially, and it's going to access those questions. That is, my main app is going to access those questions from that local storage, right? But I still need to dynamically populate it. So we are going to see that how to dynamically populate different elements on your web page. If it is not hard coded on the HTML file, then how do we use JavaScript logic to kind of dynamically populate that? And of course, there is going to be a timer that is associated for each question. Okay. And let's say that timer is going to be around 15 seconds, or you can change this value, whatever, but you get the practical idea of what logically this is supposed to do, is that each question will be available for answering for up to 15 seconds. And once the timer expires, the user should not be able to submit their particular option, right? And once the user gives their questions, their answers for each question, we are going to show them the right and wrong answer. But while doing so, we need to keep a track of total score. This is also something that we need to display. And at the very end, this needs to be displayed as a results screen, right, to show the user that, hey, you scored this much and stuff like that, right? That is basically the programming logic. And we need to kind of implement this. So implementing this part is basically mostly about programming. So what I'm going to walk you through all of these logic, and I'm going to point out or highlight actually the JavaScript aspects that is used to achieve these different programming logics one by one as we work on this, right? So this is not a coding example per se. This is more like a coding walkthrough, and then you should be trying this out or attempting it yourself, and then you can take some aspects of this coding and you can implement different parts of it as necessary for the type of project that you're doing, so that it can help you out to kind of reduce the time it takes in order to get your project up and running. Okay, so just to give you a walkthrough again of this logic that we discussed in terms of theory. So this is the landing page that we need to present to the users, right? You can change this, of course, but this is what we want to have specifically. Okay, so once the user hits start quiz, this is going to show a new window, okay, which is going to be statically coded onto our HTML page, because the rules of the quiz doesn't necessarily change unless you want to, right? You can dynamically change that, but essentially we present them with some instructions, right? So we can say that, okay, you will have 15 seconds for each question. You select an answer. It cannot be undone. You cannot change the option. You cannot select any option once the timer is done. And you cannot exit from the quiz. Once the quiz has been started, you have to finish it, right? And at the end, you will get a results screen that will show the points that you have received while answering all the questions, right? So here, then at this point of time, the user is presented with two different options. Either they can continue. If they choose to continue, that means that they have started the quiz. So that means they have to finish the entirety of all the questions that is present in the question bank. Otherwise, they are not able to quit unless they close the browser window at that point of time, right? Or they can choose to exit the quiz. So if they exit the quiz, it goes back to the landing element that is going to be shown to them. Remember, I'm calling it as a landing element because we are not changing pages. The page remains the same. And the reason why we are opting for this design is eventually, once this is done, we're going to move into React.js, right? And the type of interfaces that we develop using React.js is a single page view interface, right? So that means even if you have different menu options, only the part that changes will be re-rendered on the screen. So I will repeat this again. Please pay attention to what we are talking about, is that when you develop interfaces using a front-end framework like React.js, it relies on this concept that is known as a single page view. So what it means is that when you had developed our nav bar in HTML, CSS, when you click on a different menu option in the nav bar, it completely reloads the browser rendering, right? And a new page is basically dispensed on the user interface, right? That gets rendered here. But the logic of a single page view, a single page display is different from that, is because when you press a different menu option, it does not reload the entire window. What it does, it only re-renders the portion on your page that changes from the previous page. So that means, let's say if your landing page is an introduction page, let's say this is your landing page, right? So if I click on the start quiz button, it only changes or re-renders the component that is different from what was previously shown on the screen. It does not reload the entire window because this is the window portion here, right? So that is the idea behind how interfaces are developed and using React.js, right? So that snappy feeling that we see here, like, so if we exit the quiz, it comes back here. We don't see that the whole page disappears and then it comes back again to show new stuff. So we are not changing the pages, it remains in the same page. We are just reloading the new components that is there, right? And React makes it more easier with respect to the organization. So understanding this code is very important because this is going to be the gateway to kind of appreciating what React helps you to achieve, right? Which we cannot achieve using basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? So again, coming back to what we were talking about, so we talked about the logic of the exit button. So that is just going to bring us back to the landing screen. So this is the starting. If you continue, then it starts the app itself where you show another card. This is what we call as a quiz card. And you can see at the very top, there is a timer that is running based on a JavaScript timer function. We also have a progress bar that is kind of synced with the timer. So as the timer finishes, then the progress bar kind of goes from 0 to 100, so to speak. Each card has the question, set of options. You can click on the option as long as the timer has some value left in it. So right now, as you can see, based on the logic that we discussed, if the timer goes to 0.00, I cannot essentially click anything because at this point of time, the right answer has been shown to us, right? So there is nothing you can do. So no points will be counted for this. It will be considered as incorrect. So you can go to the next question. And once the timer is there, then you can select what you want to select. So if you select something which is incorrect at the time that you select, the timer basically freezes up at that point of time because the user has already provided their answer, right? So this is basically a conditional statement logic that if the user has already provided their answer, then we basically stop the timer at that point of time, right? We don't have a logic that kind of associates more point with correct answers given at the beginning. I have not done that. If you want to try that out, you can try that out and kind of supplement the logic of this code that the faster you give the answer, and if it is the right answer, then the amount of points that you receive is more than giving the answer at a later stage, right? So that is something that you can do. So again, when you give the wrong answer, essentially at the end screen of each question, it will mark it as wrong, and then it will still show the right answers, and the user cannot interact with this anymore, right? Then you can go to the next question, do something similar, okay? And then continue with this, okay? And then the last one, because we cannot exit this quiz unless we are done. And once the quiz is over, I only have 5 questions in my question bank, okay? It gives us the end screen, which we call as the results card. So each of these components that you see here, we will be technically calling it cards going forward, right? So we're creating these cards, which can be replicated, not in a very structured fashion if you're only working with plain JavaScript, but when we go to React, these will be known as components that we will develop for our interface, and we can kind of reuse the components and change some of the initial parameters of those components to make something entirely different or for a different unique entity and stuff like that, right? So this is the end screen. The end screen gives you 2 options. First, if you hit quit quiz, that will take you back to the landing page. If you hit replay quiz, then it will restart the quiz, right? So that means if I quit the quiz here, it will take me back to the landing component that I see here, which is basically a start button. And then I have to go through the whole process again. If I had said replay quiz, then it would have taken me to the first question again, and then we could have restarted the quiz all over again, right? But in between, there is no way that you can essentially start the quiz or basically quit the quiz in between, right? So that is something that you have to keep in mind. So let's look at the code. I hope that everybody understands the programming logic in the implementation logic that we have to implement here. So let's look at the setup of the project directory. Let's do a walkthrough of the HTML file, and let's do a walkthrough of the CSS. And then finally, let's go over the JavaScript logic that is used to implement this particular quiz app, right? So here in my Visual Studio Code, I have my project directory set up. So if you notice at the left-hand side of the Project Explorer, I have my root folder, which is the demo quiz app-master. This folder is also available on my GitHub, or everybody can access the code there. So don't worry, because we are just going to do a walkthrough here. So for now, your goal is to understand and then implement, and then probably supplement and play around to tweak a few things in order to get an understanding of what else you can do with this app, okay? So in my root folder, the first thing is I, of course, have an index.html file. I have a git ignore file, which is just to make sure that if there is anything that I don't want to push to GitHub, then I can essentially write it here. I have a JavaScript subdirectory that is going to store two things. First, the logic of my entire app, which is stored in this quizapp.js file. And then I have this questions.js, which remember is going to act as the local storage of the different questions that we are going to populate here. So if there is more question, we are going to write a for loop on this particular file, right? So this is stored as an array of objects within this file, and I will show you the structure of that in a little moment, right? But essentially what we are going to do is we have created a local storage in a file, JavaScript file, which has an array of objects. And then we are going to import that array of objects into our main logic file and then run a for loop on that and then dynamically populate each of those questions. So we're going to grab the question from there, grab the options from that array, and then we are going to grab the right answer as well, because we need the logic to kind of highlight which one is right and which one is wrong once the timer has expired or once the user has responded before the timer has expired, right? So that is basically the purpose of having this questions.js file. So anytime you want to have some little bit of local storage and you wanted to enable it based on file system based stuff, then you can of course create a JavaScript file to hold that. And we are going to be seeing this example a few more times going forward in some of the demos that we will be doing in React.js as well. We have a subdirectory for our style sheets, and we have a style file, which essentially is there. Okay, so let's go over the index.html file. More or less, there is a basic setup. So I have a CSS file that is linked with my HTML file. And then I have incorporated what we call as font awesome icons. Okay, so this is basically an icon pack, which we have used here. So a lot of the times we want to apply some neat looking icons and stuff like that for our pages, right? So Font Awesome gives us the option of copyright free icons that we can use. So instead of downloading it from your Google file or for your Google images and stuff like that, or importing the icons as images, it is easier to kind of use these third-party components such as Font Awesome and then include that as a script in your index.html file as a content delivery network link or as a CDN link, right? So in order to achieve this, what you need to do, if you use this link, it will not work for you because this link is unique to me. So what you need to do for you to use Font Awesome is basically you need to go to Font Awesome yourself. Okay, so essentially once you go there, so this is what we are looking at, and this is what I have essentially used. Okay, so what you need to do is start for free after that, and then you need to basically provide your email address that is there and go for send kit code, right? So the kit code is essentially what I am using here as well. So you will create or you will specify your email where you have to utilize it. And then after that, you need to go to this particular area, which is explore icons. And this will give you all of the different icons that are available on Font Awesome. And then you just need to search for those different icons here. or you can search for your own particular requirements. So it gives you categories of different icons that are there. You can only use the ones that are free. There are some paid icons as well. So you cannot use those particular icons which are, not freely available. So you can go for any kind of icon. You can click here, and then you can see here that there is a checkbox for free icons, right? So if you hit the free icons, then here it will show you which icons that you can use for free in your particular interface and stuff like that. So for example, let's say if you want to give an option where you are saying, oh, the users can chat with us, so I want to use this headset icon. So if you click on that headset icon, it will show you the code that you need to use depending on the type of framework that you're using. So if you're building your app in React, the code will be different. If you're building an app in, let's say, Vue, the code will be different. Here right now, what we are working with is HTML, right? So basically, I know that this is the code that I need to embed within my HTML file in order for the browser to render out this particular icon, right? So what I need to do is two things in order to integrate Font Awesome. First, provide it with your email address. It will give you a very unique link for you to use. Then in the head portion of your HTML, you need to include this script src, because this is also a script, but this is a third-party script that you are basically embedding within your app, right? So in the source file, you have to, in the source attribute, you have to specify that link that will be sent to you, and you have to give this cross origin attribute as anonymous. So there is no verification that takes place in order to embed that third-party link. So you're basically integrating it in an anonymous fashion. You don't need any authentication, so to speak, okay? And then wherever you want to use the icon that you're working with, so let's say here is an example where I have given an icon in my result box in the last screen, right? So what I did is basically I looked for the crown icon, and then when I click on the crown icon, just like we saw in this particular example for this headset icon, it will give me the code itself. So you don't have to figure out what that code is going to be. You just have to figure out which icon freely available that you want to use in your project, right? So you just copy that and just paste it in your HTML. It's as simple as that, working with Font Awesome, right? So nothing too complicated that is going on here, all right? So that is basically what entails with respect to using Font Awesome. The next thing is we need to add our questions list to this, and I'm deferring that in the local storage. So let's look at the question list real quick to understand what is there. So all we have is basically a local question bank, right? And the local part is important because we are sending this and storing this wherever the user is accessing your particular app or this particular app, right? So if you host it using GitHub Pages, then when the user specifies that URL of your application, then this entire question bank will be sent to the user side itself. So please make sure that you don't create something that is very large, right, in terms of size. So if you send that, then the loading portion of your app is going to slow down as well, okay? So what this have is a basic array, and that array is basically of objects. So each index within the array is an object itself. Okay, so that is why we call it as an array in objects. So what we have as a member of those objects is basically the numerical value or the index of the question. So you can generate a unique serial ID here. You can call it a serial number, whatever it is that you want to call it. Here, I called it as num and just gave it an index number so that I can identify these questions if there is an ever need to do so. I have the actual questions, which will be rendered on the screen. I have the answer, which will be shown, right? And the reason why we need the right answer itself is because we want to mark the correct answer as green with a right tick mark. And then we want to mark the wrong answers with red color with a cross tick mark, right? So in order to get that reference, the program needs to essentially know what the right answer is as well, okay? And then I provide the options. So the options, again, is another array of strings. So you can see there, this is an array, which is basically an object member, but it is an array itself, right? It's not a basic key value pair. So I write all the options that will be shown, and that's about it. And that kind of closes the first array object that you have here. And you repeat the same thing for all the questions that you want to put. So if you want to put more questions, then your quiz will show more questions. So I have kept an open portion here for you to add more questions, try out how this works, and connect it with the main app logic. Okay, so coming back to our index.html file, so that is what we are kind of embedding here or connecting here within the metadata of our web page, right, which is the head portion. So we are connecting our question bank or our local storage. And then finally, the last portion is the main logic of our application itself, which is kind of embedded within the quiz app. And we're going to talk about it at the very end. Okay. So what we are going to put inside, so that is all about the head portion of our web page. So what we want to put inside the body portion, which is the subjective behavior of the application, is that we have 4 different elements. Okay, so we have the landing page itself that we saw with respect to the button here. So this is basically your landing page. And then after the landing page, you have the information box or the instruction page. So that is going to be the second card component that this app is going to display. After that, there will be the third card component, which is all of the questions. So if I hit continue here, that is going to take us to the third card component. And then you can quickly browse through this. So each time this card component is rendered, it's the same card component, but what does change is the question. That is what question, the numbered question, the options, the right and wrong answer, that changes. So this is the part where we are going to dynamically populate the questions. That is what I was talking about when we said that we are going to dynamically populate the questions, because if you notice here, there is no question that is present within this quiz box component, right? We have not written any of these questions that we were working with. We have not written, you don't see anything which says, what does PHP stand for in a bolden text? We don't see any of that. If you notice here in this, we only have the components or the contents of this quiz box component, which is going to remain static, right? So that means the initial rendering of each of the card component, this timer needs to start from 15. So that is a static part. The title of this card component is going to remain the same for all the different questions that it renders. So that is going to remain static as well. Okay. And then this timeline is going to be present as a division container. So this is the progress bar or the timeline that we are calling. That is going to be present here. That is going to remain consistent across all the questions. But what does change is the text of the question itself and the options that needs to be presented. So that thing needs to be dynamically populated from our question bank. So this is the new thing that we're learning here, is how do you dynamically populate different contents in your interface depending on the user interaction. So the user interaction here is when the user clicks on this next question button. So when that happens, then you can see that a re-render takes place, but the entire component doesn't change. Only the component or the content that needs to be re-rendered is facilitated on your browser page. Okay, so that is basically the dynamic population of our application. And the last component that we are going to show on our interface is basically the result box. So that means if you continue this and get out of this, so this is the last component that we're going to see. And here's the font awesome icon that we have used. And then we have 2 more buttons here to track the events that is going to take place from this particular card component, right? So that are the main major 4 components that we have in our HTML file. So only the contents that is going to remain static will be hard coded in our HTML page. Everything else will be dynamically populated from JavaScript. So that is the whole logic of your HTML page itself, right? So the start button, all we have is basically a wrapper, which has been given a class name. And then that wrapper has a simple button, which just is going to display start quiz. So that is as simple as it gets for the first landing element of your web page. Next, we have an instruction box, which is also going to remain static because the quiz instruction remains the same. It doesn't change dynamically as such. Okay. So again, we create a wrapper. We give it a class name. We call it information box or info box or instruction box, whatever it is that you want to call it. Okay. And then we create a div wrapper, which is going to contain the title of the page. So let us go back to our initial page. So we'll just say quit quiz. So this is the rules box that we see. So we have a wrapper that kind of goes around this entire card component. Then we have a wrapper to separate the header from the rest of the page. And then this is the footer. So we have created 3 sections within this component itself. A header, which has the title, the main body of this card component, which has the instructions, and then the footer, which has the next buttons to decide what the user wants to do, whether they want to exit it or whether they want to actually start the quiz itself, right? So following that whole idea, we have this division here, which kind of keeps the title of the quiz. Then we have a division, which has the body of all the instructions that will be displayed. And then finally, we have like a pseudo footer, which has the 2 buttons that we are essentially going to show the users, right? So here we put the title, we give all of the information. We put this 15 seconds value within a span tag, which if you remember is an inline tag, right? Essentially, such that we can style this differently. So you can see that this has a purple text color. So the way we have enabled this is by putting a tag of span around the text that we want to change separately from this particular div wrapper that we have, right? And then all of this, we are kind of putting them inside their own wrapper and then giving them class names so that we can, take them up in a group fashion in our CSS file, and we can apply whatever styling that we want to the entire stage instead of doing it, let's say, one by one and stuff like that. If you choose to, there is no harm in it. You can create a list item. So as an exercise, if you want to self-try it out, instead of putting each instruction item as a div element and then putting in the information there, what you can do is you can create an ordered list, right? And then you can style the ordered list there in a way that you want to. So you can try that out as a self-exercise, and you can change this part of the component with something that you're already familiar with, right? And then finally, we have the footer portion where we just put 2 buttons, give them their separate class names, because the whole functionality that is associated with these buttons are not the same with respect to the other buttons that we have seen, which is basically the start quiz button here. Okay. Now, when it comes to the quiz box itself, that is when you start the quiz, okay, or restart the quiz, whatever that is you want to do. I will let this timer expire and talk about this. So again, we follow the same design principle for this card component, which is kind of encapsulated or wrapped around by this wrapper that we call as a div class quiz box, right? And what this particular quiz box will have is the same styling pattern or the design pattern. That is, it's going to consist of a header that consists of all the static information. Then we will have a section. The section will consist of the quiz question and the multiple choice options for each of those quiz. And then there will be a footer, which will consist of 2 buttons, okay? And then the information of how many questions is still left, right? Or which question number the user is answering, right? So to kind of go over that here, this is the header portion, the same thing. So we have the title of the quiz, and then we have a division, which says the text of timer, and then the exact timer value that is left here. So this will start with an initial value of 15. So that is going to remain static as it is shown here in line 45. We have the title here, and then the time left body, right? And then after that, there is this another element that is present on the page, right, which kind of separates the header from the main body of the card component. So this, what we have is coded using this division called timeline. And if you notice that this division doesn't have any content, because you don't want to display anything, you just want to display a progress bar using JavaScript. So we are going to implement that by capturing this division location, bringing it to our JavaScript file, the same we learned using the document.get element by ID or get element by tag name, right? So here we can use document.query selector, and then we can do a CSS-based selector syntax of .time_line in order to just capture this particular div element and then operate on it from JavaScript, okay? After that, we have the section. So you can see the section has a question. Section has 4 different options, okay? So this we cannot hard code essentially, because every time there will be a new question. So what happens if you think about it this way, you can get away with hard coding it, right? There's nothing, not allowed for it. It's just about a decision making of your design. But what happens if I add, let's say, on top of these 5 questions that we are working with right now, I add like 20 more questions. So that is a hectic job for a developer, because now you have to use HTML syntax and you have to embed all of those questions one after the other. And at a certain point of time, your HTML page is going to become very inflated, right? It's going to become very big, very hard to track with all of the things that is going on. And from a design perspective, if you think about it, that is going to kind of introduce a lot of redundancy into your development project as well, because you're just repeating the same set of elements. It's just that the content of the elements change, right? So why rewrite it again and again? That's not a good practice of development, right? So this is the reason why we have just created these sections. And what we are going to do is we're going to use the power of JavaScript on the local question bank that we have already developed. And we're going to run a for loop here, and then we're going to insert the questions into that location where it is belonging, right? So that means from JavaScript, I will do a document.querySelector, and I will say the query selector is .queryText, right? The question text. And then I'm going to run a for loop on my question bank, which is already an array of objects. And then I'm going to grab the question, and then I'm going to insert that as probably like the same way I insert these texts here. I can use a div section. I can use a p tag, depending on however you want to implement this. You can essentially populate it. So we're going to see how to do that essentially. Okay. And the same thing for our options as well. Okay. So we just created a section or a container, which is going to store it. We're going to connect this container to JavaScript, and then we're going to run a for loop on our question bank options, and we're just going to populate those options here. All right. And then finally, coming to the last component of this particular card component, right, which is the footer section of our questions component, where we are going to display the user the total number of questions that remains. And now again, this is also a dynamic aspect, that is how much question still remains, right? So that is a dynamic aspect that is going to change based on the number question that the user is on, and then how many questions still remain. So you have to do a dynamic calculation, and you have to re-render this information every time the user goes to the next question and stuff like that. So you cannot hard code this piece of information as well. So what we do is the same style we use. We just create a div container in order to put that information by dynamically calculating it through JavaScript app logic, right? And then finally, the only thing that will remain static is basically the next question button. So that is something that is already here. So we will just apply some event listener to this button, which just says that if this page if this button is clicked, you just re-render this whole thing. That is basically execute the for loop, which is going to grab the next question, the next set of options, and recalculate which question number that is. Okay, essentially that is basically what is going to be the callback function logic of the next question button. All right, and then finally, in the result box, if you continue through this, just click on this one after the other and move really quickly. Okay. So if you do this, so this is the last component. Here you can see that there is no particular header or footer as such. So what we have at the very beginning is basically an icon. So that is going to remain static, right? So I have created this div container, which consists of my font awesome icon that I just showed you a little bit ago, right? How to get that into your particular code. And then we have some text here, and then we have a score, which needs to be again dynamically computed. So that means in your JavaScript app logic, you have to keep a counter variable that is keeping a track of the fact that whether the user has answered their questions correctly or whether they have answered their questions incorrectly, so that you can compute the total score and then display that to the user at the very end. So just the way we have it here in our particular try. So I have scored 1 out of 5 in this particular run of the quiz app. So you should be able to dynamically compute that. And the reason why or how you do it is just from a programming logic, it's just maintaining a app counter, right? Where it counts +1 every time the user gives the right question answers, right? And then at the very end, you have 2 buttons essentially to replay the quiz. So it will start from the first question again. So the logic of this replay button is essentially tied up to rendering this particular quiz box and then getting all the questions again and redoing that same process. So it's basically a looping operation. Or you can quit the quiz. So if you quit the quiz, that takes you back to the very top, which is the start quiz button that is there, which is our landing button. Okay, so that is basically the flow or the logic of our interface that we are going to present to the user. So quickly going over the CSS part, there's nothing too complicated here. There's mostly aesthetic stuff that is going on here. So first of all, I have used a Google API font that we had talked about when we discussed about CSS, and this is nothing new. So I've used the @import and I have provided the URL. So this is how you can import something from outside into your CSS file. Okay, or you can specify this import link in your index.html file as well, as we had discussed previously when we were talking about Google fonts. And you can put it in the head section here by linking this Google link there. So you have two different options that you can adopt. You can either choose to put it in your HTML file, or if you would like to put it in your CSS file, then you essentially use @import directive that basically imports. And what you want to import is basically a URL, and then you provide the URL. Okay, so I'm using this font family that is known as Poppins from Google. And I just went to the Google interface or the Google's webpage of Google API fonts, and I searched for the Poppins font family, got the link, and just put it there, right? After that, the first thing that I'm doing here for the code that is highlighted is I'm resetting the default CSS styling rules that any browser may have. So I'm setting the margin to 0, padding to 0, box sizing to border box, and I'm saying that include the font family of Poppins that I have brought in here and nothing else. If the Poppins font is not supported in any user's browser, because they're using, let's say, an older version of the browser or anything like that, then the alternative font family that I want to use is basically sans serif, right? Which will be more or less available, okay? I give it a background color of purplish. So here, the color that you can see, that is basically where it is coming from, all right? And then for any kind of selection that is going to take place, I'm going to change the text color to white, and I'm going to change the background color to the same as that of my screen's background color, right? So this is basically for any kind of selection that is going to take place as a pseudo class. It is going to apply the same set of styling here, okay? Then I take all of my card components along with my start button. So here you can see the start button is basically the very first button that we see here, this particular button, okay? And then we have the information box, which is the second card component, if you recall. So if you look at this and we try to relate to what we have. So start button, that's the first division. The second component, which is the information box. Then you have the third component, which is the quiz box. And then you have the last component, which is the results box. So this selection is basically taking all of those components and centering it. So no matter what we render on the page, it will always be shown in that centered location. So if you notice here, everything is centered. And if you go to start quiz, this element is also shown in the centered location. So we're going to apply the same styling. What we say is that we want to set the position to absolute with a separation from top and left of 50%. Okay. And then we want to transform it by translating it -50% on the X and Y axis. So that is basically these 4 lines of code that you see here is another way, if you're not using Flexbox, to kind of center your elements on the web page, right? So if you keep a tag or keep a note of this code somewhere, so this is anytime you want to center something on your web page, you can use this. So if you're developing these apps which are very centered and nothing else is there in any side of the page, then this is essentially the code you can use, okay? And then I applied some box shadow around each of these elements. So if you can see here that there is a little bit of shadow vibe that is going on full sides of each of these components. So if you exit the quiz, you have the same feeling and look. You can see that there is a very light shadow here at the very bottom. The same thing follows around all of the different edges. So that is what this property is essentially doing, and it is going to give a color and some alpha transparency to each of those shadow sides, right? So these are applied to each shadow side, and you can check more of this out on the documentation guides, okay? Now we have 2 different classes, okay? One is if the information box is active, the quiz box is active, and the result box is active. And the reason why we say this is because in our HTML page, we have kind of coded all of this. And if you remember, HTML is sequential in nature, right? So that means all of the information that is present on your HTML page should be rendered out when they are coded in such sequential fashion. So typically speaking, this app here should show not just the start quiz button, but it should show the information box. It should show all of the quiz box, if not even not having the question, and it should show the result box at the same time. So that means there is something that we have done using JavaScript, which is basically suppressing the other boxes and then making their rendering dependent on the previous stage's interaction with the user. So keep that in mind. So to get an understanding, until and unless the user clicks on this start button, which is the first thing that needs to be displayed to the user, we are not going to show them the information box. So that is basically the logic here. So this CSS styling ties up with the JavaScript class name that we are going to create, where we have an active aspect of each of the components or each of the divisions that we have on our web interface, right? So then what we are saying is that you make the opacity 1. So that means if you make the opacity 1, it is visible. Otherwise, it is completely transparent or it's not visible on the page itself. You can also use the display property in order to kind of display none and then make it visible if there is an interaction. You can also go down that route, but we use the opacity property and we use the z-index property, which is the representation on the z-axis, which is how popping or how much out of the screen it is going to look, because x and y axis is the movement on either the linear way or the vertical way on the web page. That is the 2D realm, right? So, but if you use the z-index, that applies that 3-dimensional viewing aspect to your screen. So this popping aspect that you see, as if this button is kind of positioned in a heightened way from the rest of the web page. If you think about it that way, that is what this z-index is essentially helping us do, right? So all the pointer events are set to auto, so there is no specific kind of events or elements that we are specifying here. We let the web page determine what is the pointer behavior going to be. So if you go here, it is treated as a button. So you can see that the cursor kind of changes from the regular cursor to interactive button kind of cursor, right? So that you can, interact with it and the user gets the understanding of it. So we just leave that for the browser to figure that out. We don't want to specify any kind of explicit pointer events for each and every different elements that we have. And we are basically bringing this card element when it becomes active to the front of the screen, right? So that is the whole idea of this transformation, is that right now these elements are transparent when this button is clicked. So basically you see that there is this small animation that is happening such that the card is kind of coming to the front. So the way that it is doing so that the card is coming to the front. So if you exit it, you will notice that there is another animation that is going to happen. If you notice it carefully, that this box is going to kind of shrink and disappear and the previous thing is going to come back, right? So you see that shrinking value as it is happening and it's kind of going into this oblivion, so to speak. This is the part that is making it do that, like this transformation. And what it's doing is basically doing a linear translation of reducing it from top and left, and then kind of increasing the opacity and reducing the opacity depending on the logic that you're trying to implement, right? After that, we just apply some basic aesthetic styling to our start button. Okay, so what this is taking is that it takes the class, division class within which the button is present. Then it takes the button itself just to be sure that that is what you're applying the styling to. And everything else is basically very straightforward. So I'm not going to kind of talk about what each of these things does. These are self-explanatory and we have seen this before. Okay, the same thing for our information box itself. But remember, the information box is not with the active info. That is going to come later when we kind of code it or implement the logic using JavaScript itself. Okay, so the information box, again, we give it all of these CSS properties that is there, so you can go over it. Okay, the same goes for our information title and info box screen. So remember, the information title is basically what we see here at the top. That is the title here. And the box is basically this entire box that kind of wraps around all of the different contents that is present within that particular division that we have created, right? So again, the same thing, we just give it a good font size. We make the font look a little bit bolder. We make the items to center out and stuff like that. The other thing is that we are using the flexbox display within this particular division here is because there are additional content here. So the info box has 3 different sections here, right? So if you want to auto-organize each of these sections, then display flex is kind of very helpful. Similarly, if you think in terms of this information box here, we just have 5 divisions. We have not used an ordered list here, if you remember when we were discussing the HTML. So if you think about it, within this section, you have 5 different division items. So that means if you apply the flex box, then it will auto-organize based on the space that is available within this particular section. It will auto-organize all of the div items and the contents that is present there. So that is the reason why we are kind of using display flex and then centering it out and making sure that they are kind of equally spaced within that. All right. So apply some padding, apply some margin, font end, nothing too crazy that is going on. The same goes for our information box and all the buttons that is present here. So what we take here is that these buttons also need to be auto-organized as well. So we are applying our display flex there as well. And the contents, we are not just making it, equally spaced out. We are basically putting it towards the end of the flex box, so at the rightmost corner there. So it is going to start towards the end. And this is the right alignment that we kind of get from the information. So if we had done something like space it out or space between, then what would have happened is that this continue button would have been here, but this exit button would have been right here. So if you want to do that kind of styling, right, you remember sometimes we have the previous button at the very leftmost side, and then we have the right button at the very rightmost side, right? You have seen some design styles like that. We have worked with that. If you want to do that kind of styling, then you have to change this flex end to space between, right? So that it takes all of the space that is there in between within this particular section that you're working with, and it kind of pushes them to the very opposite end of the corners, right? So similarly, we take the info box, we take the buttons, we put some transition and other aesthetic elements to it. Going on to the quiz box, which is basically when you hit continue, what is going to be shown here. So this is the design of the quiz box itself. That is the division that is going to hold in all of the questions, the options and stuff like that. So you apply all of the basic stylings there. Follow the same rule in order to make that quiz box appear. That is, you kind of translate it and increase the opacity of that particular element that you're working with. Style the header of the quiz box, which is basically this whole section, which consists of the title, which consists of this timer information, this timer number, and this progress bar or timer line, whatever you want to call it, right? So that is basically the entirety of the header. And here you can see that the justify content is basically doing space between. So once you do space between, it takes this entire portion, puts as much as space between the different elements that are present so that they go to the extreme end. So this one is left aligned, this one is right aligned, and there is no more space here. So it takes the next element that is present within this header, which is this progress bar division, and puts it in the new line, right? So that is essentially how it organizes. It takes the whole space horizontally, and if there is no space left, it goes to the next space, and then it puts it there, right? So that is basically what it does with the space between aspect of the display flex box, right? Some basic styling of your font for your title, okay? And then the timer that you're going to show, which is basically this portion here, you apply some specific styling within that timer. Now the timer in itself is a section that consists of this text and this number itself. So again, we are using the flex display and space between in order to take the entire space within this subdivision, which has this text content, which is in its own division, and this number content, which is also present in a division of its own, okay? How much timer is left? You can put that styling here. The seconds of the timer, that is this particular timer when the number comes down. The timeline, which is this progress bar that you see here. So we just give the position to be absolute with respect to the header box here, which is the parent element of it. And then we just give it some color of what the background color is going to look like. All this is basically a div, and we are just going to increase the color so that it fills up the whole portion, because that is the animation that we are going to input with respect to the JavaScript when we dynamically style that portion here and connect it to the timer value or the timer function that is we are going to implement using JavaScript itself, right? This is the section that holds your question. Okay, so this entire section here, within the section, you have a class for your question text and then your option list. So we just give it some styling there, some basic styling, some options for this different options that is going to be displayed. And for the last child of the option, because if you think of this division, right? So we need to use a pseudo element in order to get to this last child and then create this separation of this section from the next portion of what we have in the page. So essentially we are revising a little bit of our pseudo elements practice that we had also seen when we were styling HTML tables. We give some pseudo class behavior that if you hover over the option list, how it is going to change. Right now you cannot access that, but if you go here, you can see that every time you hover over each of these options, some behavior changes, right? So you can essentially include that. Then we create two different classes, and these classes will be dynamically populated, and it needs to come from JavaScript itself, because we don't have what kind of answer the user is going to give, but we do know that the user is either going to give a right answer or the user is going to give a wrong answer. So we create these dynamic classes that what happens if the option is correct and what happens then the option is incorrect. So here, that is where you get this green coloring of the background and this red coloring of the background along with the icon. But this needs to be again dynamically generated from the JavaScript logic. Okay. And then finally, once the timer runs out, you cannot allow for any pointer events. That means you cannot allow for the functionality of the mouse to take place at all, right? So at this point of time, you can see that my mouse is basically disabled to interact with any of these options. But if I go to the next question, you can see how my mouse cursor is changing because the pointer event is set to auto when this timer is still active, right? But anytime this timer expires or anytime the user clicks on the particular option, this pointer events set to none basically disables any kind of interactive behavior that you can have or the user can have with your interface. So this is what this pointer event none is actually implementing, right? And then we have the icon, which is this icon here, the right icon and the cross icon. So we give it some styling for that. So if you have a tick icon, this is the tick icon itself. It will be colored green. You give it some border color, background color, and stuff like that. And if you have the cross icon, which is this icon, you color it in red, right? And then you have the footer of the page, some basic styling there. You give it some flex and all those stuff. And then some span within the footer if you have any kind of, so we have seen that here we are using some span elements from time to time in order to kind of design those texts separately. So that is what we are doing in this spans, not spam, and then color the footer button, whatever you have. Anytime you hover over these buttons, you're going to change the background color. So very basic, nothing too crazy that is happening. This is the show part of your footer. So how you're going to show it on the page. And then the result box styling, okay, with using the same principles as we did for all of the previous components, that how you're going to display that on the page and how you're going to show that on the page. And then we have an icon, which we have used from Font Awesome to kind of get to the result box. So if we move fast here, this is the icon styling that we are doing, essentially using this result box dot icon. The completion text, which is this text here, you have completed the quiz. And then the score text with a span, because we have put this part here, which is how much we are calculating inside its own elements, is that we can give it a little bit of a different styling compared to the rest of the text that you have. Okay, so that is what we are doing here in this span text and the paragraph that follows there. And then finally, for all the buttons that is present here in the result box, we kind of give it some basic color. The display of flex properties is that it auto arranges itself depending on the remaining space that is available within its division. Okay. And then color it separately as like what is going to be the pseudo class behavior if the user hovers over the quit button, or if the replay button is auto selected, and if they click that, what they're going to do and stuff like that. So that is mostly the basic CSS that we have used here. So compared to the previous calculator app CSS file, where we had essentially learned a new CSS display grid property, in this particular CSS file, I have not included anything that is new again. So it's mostly a revision of all the things that we have covered up until now. So we have used a combination of position absolute, and we have used a combination of display flex with different parameters of display flex of how the item needs to be aligned, whether it needs to be centered or whether it needs to be right aligned, and those kind of things, right? So the other thing that we have seen here, which is a little bit new with respect to CSS properties, is basically the pointer events. So when you set pointer events to none, basically you are disabling from the user's perspective any kind of interaction that can take place with your interface, right? So anytime for any component you set the pointer events to none, again, remember the user cannot interact with your application at that point of time, right? So finally, coming to your actual programming logic, you can see that there is a lot going here, but if you break it down and if you connect it with this logic that we are trying to build, right, you will understand that there is actually just 5 different components or logic that you're trying to implement. So the entirety of this code is kind of captured in these 5 categories, right? So every time there is a button, you know that the button is either going to make you move forward or it's going to take you to another kind of component, right? So what you have to do is basically you have to select all of the different components first and foremost that is present in your HTML file, such that you can start manipulating them and you can start modifying them based on whatever your requirements are. So what I do at the very beginning is I first select all the required elements from my HTML file, right? Because this way I can connect the entirety of my HTML file with my JavaScript file. I can save all of those different HTML elements as an object, as a JavaScript object, right? And then I can apply the document APIs, properties, and methods using those objects, right? So life becomes simpler. So instead of bringing in these elements when you need it, right, I treated that as an import for your program, right? You don't import somewhere midway in your program, you import it as at a particular location, right? All your packages, your header files are present at the very beginning. So that's the same thing that I did. All I did, use the document API, use query selector such that I can use the same CSS type syntax. I don't have to, think of new syntaxes. I look at my HTML file from the very beginning, okay, of my body. Anytime I notice that there is a custom defined class name, I just grab it, right? So here I take the start button. So that is basically the first element that you see, and I store it in an object here called start button itself, so that these names are kind of self-explanatory and relatable to each other. So I do the same thing for my information box. I do the same thing for my exit button, continue button, a quiz box, a result box, a restart button, a quit button, and then these, from that point of time, this kind of completes at this point of time most of the major elements that is present on your HTML page. So now what remains is to basically get the questions and their options from this questions.js button. And remember, I have imported this in the HTML file. You also have the capability to not do that in the HTML file. And what you can do, you can write an import statement here so that you can bring this entire array of objects as an array within this file itself. So if you want to do that, just to give you a quick idea, that if you want to place the import statement here in the JavaScript file rather than in the HTML file, if you do it in the HTML file, it is basically globally available. So anything that is connected to the HTML file can be accessed by other subcomponents. That is something that you have to keep in mind. However, if you have to export it, the first and foremost thing that you have to do is you need to write an export statement here. So what you need to do is, when you're doing this, instead of doing let questions here, you will have to type something along the lines of export. Whoops. Okay, what you have to do here is basically you have to write something like export default. And I say default because this is the only data structure that we are taking out from this page. If there were separate data structures, then we had to not use the default and we had to write separate export statements for each of the data structure that is present. So what I can do here is export default questions and then equals, and then the array, and then I can write whatever I want within that array. So that will create that will create the exportability of this JavaScript file. Remember, this is when you're not connecting the JavaScript file to the HTML. Okay, otherwise you do the script src as we have done it. So once you have done the export default here, when you come to this location, okay, you need to basically import that, okay, into an object of its own, right? So here you need to write something like import and then you can give it a self-defined name. Now, this name is going to be something that is unique to this page, right? Or this JavaScript file. It is nothing to do with whatever naming convention you gave in that other file that you're trying to export. So what you say is import questions from, and now you give the path name within the double quotes of where this file essentially exists. So what we are going to say is that if you go to the root folder, we first need to know where this file is. So we might have to back out. So we know that both of these folder files are in the same directory location. So all I need to do is // which is the root folder for this file, which is the subfolder JavaScript, and then just specify questions.js. Okay, so what it does, it takes the data structure that you have exported here. So here you have written export default questions. So questions is basically an array of objects. So when the interpreter will see this statement here, that import questions from questions.js. So what will happen is basically it will take whatever exporting is happening within this file, and it will save it in this object that you have created within your within this JavaScript file. So now anytime you need to access any content within the questions.js file, you can just access the object that you have here locally present, and then you can perform the same set of operations, right? So that is how you link between two different JavaScript files. And we are going to see this very often when we work with React.js as well. So this was just to give you a quick preview of how this is done, right? It is very straightforward, all right? So the only thing you remember is that if there were multiple data structures that or multiple units that you're trying to export out of this, right? You cannot give this default keyword. The default is kind of representing the fact that this is the only thing that is there to export, right? So if you have multiple things, you need to have a separate export for each one of those aspects, right? So that is something that you need to keep in mind. So that way, your questions.js file will only be available to this JavaScript file, which is implementing it, and not any other file that might be present. If you link it with your HTML, remember, it's basically globally available across the board, whichever components. I can just simply access it, okay? So that is the reason why here, when I am doing the option list and stuff like that, and when I'm trying to get the questions and stuff like that, I can just refer to my HTML and I can get it, right? So this way, I essentially create the objects for all the components that is essentially present on my HTML page, okay? So what we are going to do next is add event listeners. That is the first step. Two step, as we discussed all the time, grab the element, add the event listener, right? Those are the 1-2 combo that you need to have. When you add the event listener, you need to start writing the logic as to what will happen when that event takes place. Always remember this simple strategy, if you're new to this domain, is that's your 1-2 combo. Grab the elements using document.query selector, and within that specify the CSS selector. And then take that object and then use the .add event listener method in order to specify the event that is going to take place on that element that you have captured, and then specify the logic as the second parameter of that add event listener method. If you remember this, then you have an understanding on how you can take your first steps towards making your application a little bit more interactive, right? So here I take the start button. So if you all remember, this is the start button. Okay, so now this HTML element is stored inside this JavaScript object. I use the .add event listener method. The first property is what event I'm trying to track. So here I'm just trying to track a click. It doesn't matter if it's a left click, right click, or a middle mouse button click. All I'm going to track is a click. The second parameter is, again, as we had discussed, a callback function. So the callback function takes an event parameter that we outline as this character E. This parameter is fed into the app logic. And you notice here that we are dynamically generating this active info class at this point of time. So what we are doing is we take the info box, which is basically the info box button, which will be shown in the next page once you click that. We access its class list, okay, and add a new type of class. So when you want to add a new class, you're basically taking the class list and using the .add method. And the parameter of the add method is basically the string that will be added as a new class name to this particular object. And now if you remember, in the CSS file, we have actually created somewhere, I hope everybody does remember that, there was an active info box in addition to the info box. I think it was here, right here. So you can see that we have done the same thing for our quiz box and the result box. So every time, so this is how JavaScript is dynamically populating something on the web page, is that we have created a different class name dynamically through JavaScript. And what we are doing is we are taking that element to which that class list or new class name needs to be appended to, and we are using the .add method of the class list, and we are adding it, right? And if this happens, that is once this takes place, this is going to take place anytime the user clicks on the start button. So if that happens, the file basically goes to CSS and it notices that, okay, this is what I need to do when it is active or when I see a class name active. And that class name active is dynamically being added by JavaScript itself. And so it takes or inherits all of the different, not inherits, but it basically applies all of the different CSS properties of that particular element. And that's how we are able to hide or display something on the web page, dynamically speaking, right? So similarly, we do the logic of the exit button. Okay, so if the exit button is clicked, okay, again, same process. We are just going to remove the active info. Okay, so that means if we go to this next screen, if we click on the exit button, we need to basically hide this particular card component. And remember, the only time or the only way this card component is being rendered on the web page is as long as this class name active info remains. So we dynamically use this add method of the class list, which is associated to this object, in order to render it. So all we have to do is when this user clicks this exit button, it needs to take us back to the start button, right? So we just need to hide that component which was being displayed, because this is the first element, this remains. Every other element is at this point hidden. It is present, but it is hidden, right? It's basically transparent. So you cannot really see it, so to speak, right, on the web page. So all we do is we use the opposite of the add method, that we remove the class name that is actually showing that box. So that gets hidden, right? The next logic is, what if now the user doesn't click the exit button, they just click the continue button. So if we do the continue button, we need to basically show the quiz box. So that means to the quiz box component, we need to add the class name that will allow our CSS stylings to basically display that quiz box component. So what we do is we take the continue button, add an event listener to it, which is going to be the same thing, click. There is no mouse key press going on here. And we basically need to take the information box, remove the active info that will hide that information box that you see right now on the screen. And then we are going to take the quiz box object, and then to its class list, okay, we're going to add the active quiz, which is going to show the quiz box, okay? And in doing so, we are going to call the show questions method, okay? We are going to call the counter, which is going to keep a track of the parameters. We're going to call a function called start timer, which is going to start counting down the timer from 15. So 15 is the initial value. And then we are going to call a separate function that is going to draw that progress bar that we see when the question happens, right? So just the 4 pieces of dynamic information. So everything that is dynamic and interactive will be in JavaScript. Rest of the stuff is done through HTML and CSS already, right? So here again, to repeat, we hide the information box, okay, in the same way as we did in the previous 2 pieces of code. We make the active quiz box a part of the class list of the quiz box. So start using our CSS the way we have designed. It can be displayed. We call a function to show the questions. We call a function to show how many, or keep a track of how many questions have been answered, how many questions are remaining, those kind of stuff. We call a function, pass it an initial value of the timer. Okay, so it's going to count down the timer from there. And then again, another function that is going to draw basically this progress bar that you see going on here from left to right, because those are essentially the 4 things that we have. Show the question, keep a track of which number of question here, keep a track of the timer, and keep a track of the progress bar. That's all there is with respect to the logic of implementation of the quiz box, right? So now, if you need to go and check what is happening, but before that, we will just do the same thing, that if we restart the quiz, we need to kind of implement all of this different variables and stuff, like we need to reset that, right? Because if you notice that we have created all of these counters that tracks which question number, how much timer is left, and all those kind of information. So that means anytime the restart quiz button is clicked, we need to reset these variables as well. In addition to the changes that we do in terms of hiding the quiz box, hiding the end result box, and then again showing the quiz box, we need to reset all of our variables or counters that is keeping a track of different things that is happening. And then we need to recall the functions again, right? We need to purge all of the previous information, reset everything, and we need to recall it again. So that is why here you can see the restart quiz button. When you click that button, these are the different activities that are going to take place. If the quit quiz button is done, the easiest way, instead of adding or blocking clause names, is by accessing the window API. Remember, the window API is everything that kind of wraps around the document itself. That is our browser window. So that is another second default API that we had already discussed. Okay. So what it does, it takes the window API, accesses the location property, and then calls the reload method. So what it does is this, it reloads the page. Essentially, it's the same as, adding the address in the URL bar and then kind of doing it again. Okay. So what happens when the next button is clicked? So that is basically when here we are in the next quiz question. So that is the logic of the next button. Same things that you have to keep in mind: identify what logic you want to implement, connect it to the HTML element using JavaScript, and then implement that event listener and the logic that is associated with the event listener. That's the basic steps that you follow for any type of application project. And then how you write the logic, that is up to you. You have to figure that out. But how you implement the logic from a JavaScript perspective is pretty simple. Connect with the element, add the event listener, specify what event you're tracking, and then provide the logic of that particular event listener. That is, what are you going to do if that event listener actually tracks that event from taking place? So that means if I do click this button, what are you going to do about it? That's a programming logic. That is not a web systems logic or implementation logic. So if the next button is clicked, we basically have to update all these counters, right? We have to reset the counter for timer, because for every question you get a new timer, right? From the very beginning. But you have to increase the question count. You have to increase the question number, make that into 2. The question count becomes 2. The user score, depending on whether they answered the previous question right or wrong, you have to update this information. You have to reset the counter line. You have to reset the counter value. You have to reset the width value. So these are all logic, right? We have to understand that logic. There is nothing to teach here when it comes to logic itself. So that is all I'm doing here, is that I am essentially, as long as I have not reached the last question, because if the last question is reached, we don't want to go outside of the bounds of the loop that we are running. So we double check that how many questions are there. So remember, questions is basically an array of objects. So we can access the length property -1 to get access to the last index. So the question count is keeping a track of which index question we are on. So as long as that is less than the last index of the array, we will reset or do all of these different logical operations. That is, we increase the question number, we increase the question count, we call the functions that is going to show or display the question, and the counter that is going to be displayed on the page itself. So this is basically this one counter that we are seeing here. Okay, so all of the stuff, the time left that is going to be shown, and then the next button is going to be removed. So that is how you disable it when a question is active. So if you notice here, you don't see the next question until the timer has expired or until the user has actually interacted with any one of the options here. Once the interaction takes place, then this particular button is shown. So we follow that same logic we have followed for all of the different boxes, is that we basically are going to hide the next button until the timer has expired or until the user has given a marking or has basically provided a selection of their particular option. Okay, and then the show result function is what is going to style these right answers, these wrong answers. If the user gave the right answer, then the show answer or the show result function is going to do that new coloring and stuff that we have already coded in CSS. So that is the purpose of this show result function. Okay, so now coming to showing the question itself. So if I will tell you about how to show the questions, and then you can get the same logic and the same understanding goes for how to show the options itself, because you're basically grabbing this stuff. All right, so let's look at how we are going to do it. So we take the object, the question text section, which is present here in our HTML file. So if we go down here, so this is the division that we have created, and you can see here there's a documentation which also talks about that this is the location where we want to insert the question. So what we do is we bring that question text here, store it in this object, JavaScript object here. Okay, so now what we want to do is for each question, we are going to put the index number, which is basically the number of the question here. This is the first key value, and then the text of the question itself. So those are the two things that we need to dynamically populate on our interface, right? So this is an important thing that you guys can learn and can apply it in some of your projects if it is appropriate, right? If it is applicable, essentially. So what we do is we create this local storage or this local variable here. We put a span element within these single quotes because this is something string in JavaScript itself. JavaScript does not understand HTML as such, right? So JavaScript will just think of it as a plain text. But once this is inserted onto HTML as a complete string, then HTML will basically be interpreted that this is a span tag. So that is why we are writing the HTML code, part of the HTML syntax as strings. And then whatever JavaScript we have, we are just bringing it in. So here we know that the questions is an array. We take the index number. So the index number is presented as a parameter to this particular function. So we can grab it from there. Then it's an array of objects. So that means we need the dot operator to access the key. So this is the key that we want to access. Then we use the string concatenation operator, or otherwise you can use the backtick or the string literals. You can try that out. You can rewrite this. We give the dot and all of the styling stuff. And then we again go to the array, take the index number and grab that question, and that's it. Right? So that is all there is with respect to the question showing. And we do the same thing, that we create a new variable for all of the options. And the way we are doing the options is the same way we did the styling for our information box, is that instead of doing an ordered list and stuff like that, for each option, we create a division, and we know that every question has 4 options. That is an information that is predetermined by us. And then within that, for each of these options, we're just putting a span tag and then grabbing for each index the options that is present. So the options we know is basically an array of array, right? So here we go to quiz, questions, get the index, use the dot operator to access the key value, which is the key options, and then that is an array itself. So we put the last index, first, second, third, and so on to get it. Now, the way you add dynamically different elements too, now we have created these variables, right? But we still need to take these variables and somehow dynamically embed this here in this location of the HTML file on our interface. We need to render that. So in JavaScript, the way you do that is you take the object where you want to add it. So basically the object where I want to add it is question text. If you notice here, question text is the object that is connected to the div that is present in our index.html file. So this is the div what question text is connected to, this q underscore text. So we take that element first. That is the element within which we want to insert something, right? That is the first step. Then we access this property that is known as inner.html, which kind of implies the fact that what I'm going to add to this particular object, which is basically an HTML element, is going to become a child of that element. That is what this inner HTML is essentially going to do. And all I do is basically parse or assign whatever content that I'm trying to add to that add to that object as an inner HTML. And that's it. That's all you need to do in order to add a child element dynamically using JavaScript into your HTML. Okay, so we do the same thing. We access option list. Now remember, option list is this div here. So whatever the children node of this option list is going to be, it's basically the options that you need to show. So all you do is option list dot inner HTML. So that means whatever will be assigned will become a child node of this. Okay, and then I just take this this variable that I have created previously, so that I don't have to write all of this here itself. So it's a more cleaner way of writing it. So I just assign it, and then it becomes a child node of that. Okay. So the same way, you can set all of the on-click abilities of the options. That is what happens when the option is clicked. What are you going to do? What are you going to set the attributes as? Okay. And then you can create this stick icon. Remember, the stick icons are also being dynamically generated. So I create a variable for the stick icons where I embed the font awesome code that needs to be rendered. And then I will simply just use the inner HTML method again to kind of add it there, right? But the inner HTML in this particular tick case, if you notice here, if you see here, when you're adding this question and this option, right, it is basically a child of the division that is capturing the question and the option, right? We have two different divisions. So that is why we are using inner HTML, because we want to add as a child. But if you notice the stick mark here, which is also a dynamic addition that we are doing. So we are creating this HTML code, which will be dynamically embedded using JavaScript. So we are saving that in a particular variable, right? But what we want to do here is not the same as inner HTML to a certain degree, because if you pay attention, if I do inner HTML here on the option list, then this tick mark will be treated as a child, right? So this will not be on the same level of our document object model. So this will come in a new line. So the problem then is either you have to change your CSS code, or what you can simply do is change the behavior of where or how you add this new HTML element using JavaScript. So what I do here is, instead of changing the CSS file, what I do is I take this another new method, which is insert adjacent HTML. So that way, whatever I am going to add is going to be a sibling of the object with which I am associating this property or this method with. Okay, so this method also gives us another attribute or parameter that we can insert, is where that insertion is going to take place. So this is what I specify here, is that this insertion is going to take place before the end of this particular element. Okay, so that means it remains a sibling and it is going to be added before this particular element ends. So that is why we see that the representation of this tick mark takes place at the very right of this particular element. So it still is treated for this particular element as a sibling, but the before end parameter allows me to position it at the very end itself, right? So that is kind of some kind of benefits that we are getting by using JavaScript and this insert adjacent element in order to set those tick marks and dynamically generate it based on that. Okay. So again, anytime you want to enable or disable, show or not show a particular element on the page, all we have done is we have created separate classes for that and styled it in CSS. And we are using JavaScript and this attribute for each object that is known as class list. And we are using the method of either adding or removing those class lists, or those class names, such that the appropriate CSS stylings can be applied in a dynamic fashion. So if you notice, that is how we are going to do it. There are, of course, multiple ways of achieving the same goal. This is how we are doing it in this particular aspect, right? So again, when you go to the result box, you hide all of the remaining boxes that is there, and then you follow that same design logic that we have for the rest of the code, and we just add that active result, which is associated with the result box, and then it shows up. Okay, and then we have already created a variable here which tracks the scoring that is taking place, or how many scores are there. So we have created this customized message based on the threshold of the answers that the user gives. So it will check if the user score is 3. It generates this custom message, saves it in the variable. Same goes for other scoring as well. Then uses inner HTML to add that custom message, which is coded as an HTML string, as a child to wherever the location is in the result box. And that is how it kind of adds it, right? And then the codes here from line 204 is basically to control the timer behavior, all that is there. So we just create a set timer function, that is the set interval function that is used to kind of control the timer. And then we provide it with the timer function itself. So this is basically a function passed in as a parameter. And then we provide the 100 units count, the 1000 units count, in order to keep a track of the timer. Okay. And then what we have to do is basically decrement the timer every time this timer function is called. So this is the function that is calling, and this is the interval, the 1 second interval that is there, the 1000 milliseconds, so 1 second interval. So every 1 millisecond or 1 second, this timer function gets called. And what happens in the timer function is that it's basically just decrementing the timer, right? And then what happens is you can add the content there. So here you can see this number needs to change, right? But what this is doing is in JavaScript only. So we need to have a way to kind of update this value through HTML, essentially. So the JavaScript needs to basically modify the HTML and make sure that it can display the correct value as this timer changes, right? So all we have to do is we have to first set up a conditional statement that between 15 to 11, we have 2 digits. And once it goes below 10, okay, or below 9 itself, 9 and below, then you switch into single digits. So we have to add a 0 before that actual number. So that's all we are doing here, is that if we are saying that, okay, it goes into single digit, then text content is what is used to change the text content of a particular HTML element, right? So here we know the timer, if we look at our index.html5, it starts from 15, right? So this text content, this is the text content. So if you want to access the text content of any HTML through JavaScript, you basically use the property of text content itself. So what we are going to do here is we're going to take that text content, we're going to add a 0 to the very beginning. So here, and we're going to append whatever value is there to the timer's content. And then we are going to add that to that HTML element. So this is the way when you go to the next question, the things gets rendered here. So this app is kind of stuck here. Okay. So when you see here, the time starts to change here after every 1 second. Okay. So this text content is being changed. So the text content that is there within this div content is being changed by JavaScript, and that is updated here by the browser. And that is how you see as if the timer is going down. But all that is happening is that we have a tracker here, a counter that keeps a track of when the timer, or what the timer is. We take that value and we just update or modify the text content of the div element that has the timer information. Okay. And then if the timer is less than 0, you basically have to make sure as if or the user cannot interact with your app. So this is what this piece of code does. And then the option is going to be disabled. So we go to the disable class, and essentially the user cannot interact, and there is a CSS styling that is associated with that. And then finally, we have the last portion of our logic, which is a progress bar that kind of mirrors the timer value that is left. So you basically have to take the timer attribute and you have to pass it as a parameter to the function that is going to keep a track of it. Okay, we set a width to it. Okay, and we're going to do the same logic. We're going to call a timer function after every particular units. And then that timer function is just going to increase. Okay, remember the progress bar needs to increase. It doesn't decrease, right? So the logic is a little bit reversed, right? The timer reduces, the progress bar increases, right? So every time we just add a new unit to it, and all we do is we change the style. So this is the other thing. We learned about how to add entire HTML contents to your pages using inner HTML or insert adjacent HTML. We learned about how to modify the text content by using .text content of any JavaScript object. And the third thing we are seeing here is how to dynamically update the style using JavaScript by using the style property. And then after that, specifying what style that you want to change. So what we are doing is essentially we are changing the width of this particular div by adding the timer value, which is incremented in every step, and then providing it as a pixel unit, right? So when you do that, then essentially the width of that timer line keeps on increasing, right? And it gets redrawn again and again, right? So that is how we are keeping a track of all of the different. And this is one is basically the question counter, which is what you see here at the bottom of the page. So all it does is that it takes the use of this index, which is keeping a track of how many questions have been presented. And then it creates this HTML line of code. And again, through inner HTML, it just presents that variable as a child of the area where you want to add it. Okay, so as a takeaway, the main things when it comes to JavaScript is, of course, we revised all of the different concepts that we had. Okay, but some of the main things that we learned when it comes to JavaScript aspects is basically how to add elements, HTML elements dynamically. Okay, so here what we learned about is this method or this property called inner HTML. All right, so we learned about this. All right, we also learned about insert adjacent HTML. There are also ways in which you can add it as a parent itself or as a child itself. So you can again check out my tutorial on JS DOM, which is available on GitHub to look at the other references as well. We learned how to modify the text content dynamically using JavaScript. So essentially there is a property that is known as text content itself. So if you want to access and modify the text itself, which is enclosed by an HTML element, then you can use this particular property, to access that. And then if you want to change the style itself, okay, style using JavaScript, then what you can do is you can access this property that is basically the object dot style dot, and then after that you need to specify what type of style that you're trying to change. So here the only thing that you need to remember is that if you have a single word styling rule such as width, you can simply write it as such, right? But if you think about it in terms of CSS, let's say if you have a 2-word styling rule, right? So for example, let's say background dash color. So that is how you provide background color. But if you're doing the same thing using JavaScript, then you would have to do object dot style dot, this is CSS syntax, right? So you cannot use this in JavaScript. So what we do is we change all of the 2-word and multiple word phrases into camel casing. So that means we will simply write background color. And then you can provide whatever value that you want to provide, and that will dynamically update this. So that kind of wraps up our discussion for this class. For you, you should practice this particular exercise. Try out the exercises that is given in your homework assignment as well. And the self exercise we discussed in the last class, where you create a simple counter. You click a plus button, the counter value increases. You click a negative button, the counter value decreases. If you try that, fundamentally, even if you are new to this domain, you would have a good grasp as a beginner with respect to how you can use JavaScript to make interactive and dynamic web applications. Okay. So if you have any questions, please do let me know. And from the next class, which is also going to be online this coming Thursday, we are going to start discussing our React.js front-end framework and how we can get rid of HTML altogether and use JavaScript-like XML syntax in order to develop our front-end applications. Okay, so I'll stop the recording here and I will see you all again online on next Thursday.